Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we are reviewing The Deep House, an underwater-based horror film that kind of popped up on Netflix as being in one of the top 10 in the UK. And I found the premise quite interesting, so I thought I would give it a watch. Having seen it now, the premise is definitely the most interesting part of it. The execution is quite lackluster, and I think although you've got to be merciful to B-list horror films, which this film definitely is, you know, it's not got the biggest budget, I think you still have to hold them to a certain standard. And what The Deep House has in setup and premise, it does not have in execution and payoff. The idea of a kind of haunted house underwater with divers becoming trapped is really fun and really fresh, but I'd say within the first 10 minutes you know you're not in for a great film. Obviously it's not got the most cinematic kind of visual style because it's not got the biggest budget, and that's okay. It's more the kind of threadbare glaring holes in character development that shine through in those first 10 minutes. You're basically following two influencers, or one influencer and his girlfriend who sticks with him for reasons that aren't explained because he's so unlikable, as he's kind of pushing for views and trying to find the next thing to kind of discover for his channel that's going to make him viral. The relationship really isn't tucked into much besides to kind of expose why these two shouldn't be together, and it doesn't really justify why they are together. And I think when you haven't got compelling lead characters, your film's already fallen apart. But yeah, then they go to this lake, they hear about the kind of local stories from a kind of sketchy guy who takes them to this lake spot where there's a kind of fully preserved house underneath at the bottom of the lake. And the best part of the film comes in that section where it's kind of 20-25 minutes of underwater cinematography, of them just kind of making their way down into these murky depths, finding the house and starting to explore it. The kind of suspense that they managed to ramp up there is okay. And that kind of middle chunk of the film, that's the build-up, is quite well done. But then for me the film kind of falls flat again because of how it embraces the horror elements of the story. I thought this film would have been better and probably should have gone for a more simplistic approach of have this house be haunted by like a siren, or kind of haunted by a witch who was drowned for her practices in kind of the medieval times, something like that, who was still living below. But the Deep House opts for kind of, you know, the most cliche, the most basic and the most uninteresting option, which is a weird family who practiced paganistic rituals and sacrificed people are kind of dead under there and kind of reanimate to go after this couple. And that just was so bland to me. I thought there was so much more potential with the kind of supernatural options that they had as opposed to what they went for. Even the first sighting we get, which should have been this chilling kind of jump moment, felt a bit flat. And from then on out, the horror really does nothing to pull you in. It's just pale bodies underwater kind of slowly creeping towards you. As soon as you kind of see these people start to reanimate, you're like, okay, there's just no scare factor in that at all for me. It was more intense watching the claustrophobia of them trying to figure their way out, and I think the survival thriller elements of it were so much more interesting and intense than the supernatural. The other area where this goes wrong in that kind of final act is in the actual filming. There was so much kind of like murky water or debris or kind of bubbles getting in the way of a lot of the sequences, so you couldn't actually see what was going on. It was just so chaotic and shaky and blurry at certain points that the film just really couldn't capture any kind of intensity or visual clarity with what was going on to get you intense. And the acting at times, it has to be said, does come across as quite stale. There's a moment where the boyfriend gets possessed and speaks through this kind of supernatural voice. It's so unironically funny because of just how unscary it ends up being. So I think The Deep House has a good idea at its heart, but makes some poor story choices and doesn't really have visual panache to make it work at the end. So it's definitely a bit of a dud, definitely one of those B-list horror films that you're like, oh, that sounds good, but let's keep scrolling for options when you get past it on Netflix. But if you have seen it, please let me know what you guys think. Please also consider liking and subscribing to the channel, guys. That's always a huge help for me. And in the meantime, we'll see you for the next vid.